Republicans and Democrats often boil the issues of D.C. and Puerto Rico statehood down to a sheer numbers game in the Senate. Former Republican Senator Martha McSally summed up the right-wing argument pretty succinctly when she said,
"They're going to make D.C. and Puerto Rico a state and get 4 new Democrat senators. We'd never get the Senate back again."
But the reality of Puerto Rico statehood is more complicated than a partisan battle waged over control of Congress. The truth is, Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S. is rooted in a history of oppression and discrimination. And there is a genuine, substantive battle between those who believe that Puerto Rico should be a state and those who see statehood as the ultimate triumph of a colonial power. When you think of what the United States looks like, you probably picture a map that looks something like this: the 48 continental states, plus Alaska and Hawaii. But our perfectly rounded out 50 states is hardly the full picture. In fact, there are roughly 4 million U.S. citizens not living in the 50 states. Nearly 700,000 of those live in Washington, D.C. But the vast majority of that 4 million, about 3.3 million, live about 1,000 miles off the coast of Miami, in Puerto Rico. In the last few years, D.C. and Puerto Rico have taken on something of a special role in our politics. Both lack congressional representation and have political movements that actively campaign for statehood. But for the most part, this is where the similarities end. There's a stark difference that sets them apart. D.C. is a U.S. capital. Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. And yet, D.C. and Puerto Rico statehood are often tied together, viewed through the same U.S. partisan political lens. But this political lens ignores the truth that Puerto Rico is a nation with its own history and people, a nation that has been a colony of the U.S. since Washington invaded in 1898. Let's first look at D.C. A 2016 referendum on D.C. statehood found that 79% of D.C. residents wanted to make the district a state. Democrats in Congress have run with this. In April, by a vote of 216 to 208, the House of Representatives voted to make D.C. the 51st state. And yet, the legislation will very likely die in the Senate. D.C. residents often sum up one of their main arguments for statehood on the district's license plates: taxation without representation. D.C. residents pay federal income tax. They vote in presidential elections, and yet they have no voting representation in Congress, and therefore no say over how their taxes are actually spent, which does tend to be something of a sore spot for Americans. Like residents of Washington, D.C., residents of Puerto Rico lack congressional representation. But unlike D.C., they don't vote in presidential elections. They also don't pay federal income tax, but must operate under the U.S. imposed financial and economic burdens, which also has its benefits. It's part of why you've probably read some headlines about uber-rich individuals moving there. Rich, tax-avoiding individuals are exploiting local and federal tax laws at the expense of working Puerto Ricans. But while D.C. residents by far have made a pretty clear-cut case for statehood and their desire for it, the question of whether Puerto Rico should or wants to become the 51st or 52nd state is at the center of a long, profound, and emotional national debate, one that is currently dividing the island in two. Article 4, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution says, new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union. It then goes on to say that new states can't be formed within the boundaries of existing states without the consent of those states and the Congress. But that's all the Constitution has to say on the matter, and it's shockingly vague. As a result, this process has looked very different at different times in U.S. history. At best, it is an inexact art that initially went something like this. Step 1, there's supposedly uncharted territory. 2, that territory becomes populated by American settlers who displace whoever was there in the first place. 3, the incorporated territory holds a referendum vote to determine the people's desire to become a U.S. state. 4, representatives of the territory petition Congress for statehood. 5, the territory adopts a form of government and constitution that are in compliance with the U.S. Constitution. 6, both houses of Congress vote on whether to admit the state to the Union. 7, the president signs off on the addition of a new state. This process worked pretty well for the first years of U.S. independence. But in the lead up to the Civil War, the statehood process became steeped in national politics as Congress tried to precariously balance free and slave states. The politicizing of this process peaked in 1889 as Republicans created the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, all within a year, and in doing so, created 12 new senators. By February of 1912, all the land that we now consider the lower 48 had officially become U.S. states. But it's the creation of our 50th state that clearly demonstrates how and why Puerto Rican statehood is a complicated and hardly settled issue. The Hawaiian Islands were first settled by Polynesians over 1,500 years ago. They remained untouched by the West until 1778, when Captain James Cook became the first European to make contact with the islands. In an all too familiar story, Cook and his crew of white settlers quickly infected native Hawaiians with disease. By one estimate, between 1778 and 1840, the population of native Hawaiians had decreased 84%, a collapse of hundreds of thousands of natives who were either killed or forced to flee. In the early 1800s, white missionaries and settlers arrived and quickly took advantage of the fertility of the Hawaiian land. Over the next 100 years, American sugar magnates came to dominate the island and became increasingly powerful figures, tying the Hawaiian economy ever closer to the U.S. In 1893, Sanford Dole, yes, the pineapple guy, and other sugar magnates staged a U.S. military-backed coup to depose the Hawaiian queen Liliuokalani. The queen was forced to abdicate, and the island came under the control of a provisional government led by Dole. Hawaii was officially annexed as a U.S. territory in 1898. That same year, the United States declared war on Spain. This would come to be known as the Spanish-American War, and it effectively lasted just 3 months. In December of 1898, Spain ceded control of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States. And this is where Puerto Rico's complicated colonial relationship with Washington begins. After U.S. troops invaded, the island became a colony of the United States, belonging to the U.S., but not part of it. From 1898 to 1900, Washington kept Puerto Rico under military control. In 1900, President McKinley signed the Foraker Act, establishing a civil government in Puerto Rico. But this new government wasn't exactly democratic. Under the Foraker Act, the new governor and executive council of Puerto Rico were appointed by the U.S. president. The status of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans changed again in 1917 with the passage of the Jones-Shafroth Act, which was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. This law imposed U.S. citizenship on the residents of Puerto Rico without their consent and established a Bill of Rights for the territory, many of those rights favoring the United States. While some Puerto Ricans argued for citizenship, this provision served an entirely different purpose for the Wilson government. The Jones-Shafroth Act allowed Puerto Rican men to be drafted into the U.S. military, and it did so just before the U.S. entered World War I. Ultimately, around 20,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted into the war.
The presenting sponsor of Cricket History is Demz, the first of its kind investment fund that through extensive research ensures you're only investing in S&P 500 companies that donate over 75% of their contributions to democratic causes and candidates. You can finally put your money where your vote is. Search for the Demz ticker, that's DEMZ, wherever you invest, or visit Demz.fund to learn more. Carefully consider the fund's investment objectives, risk factors, charges, and expenses before investing. This and additional information can be found in the fund summary or full prospectus, which may be obtained by visiting Demz.fund.
It wasn't until 1947 that Congress granted Puerto Ricans the power to elect their own governors. But before they even had the chance to do so, the existing U.S. appointed governor approved Public Law 53, also known as the Gag Law or La Ley de la Mordaza. The law suppressed Puerto Rico's independence movement. It made it illegal to fly the Puerto Rican flag, write about independence from the U.S., or publicly engage in pro-independence activities, among other provisions. Violators of the law could be imprisoned. Many were. It was under the guise of this same suppression that President Harry Truman signed the Puerto Rico Commonwealth Bill in 1950, which allowed the island to develop its own constitution. Although some Puerto Ricans supported the legislation, Puerto Rican nationalists who advocated for independence vehemently opposed it. And general resentment over these repressive measures bubbled over into an assassination attempt on President Truman by Puerto Rican nationalists that same year. Throughout these decades and thereafter, Puerto Rican nationalists and other independence advocates were subjected to persecution and violent attacks, including the Ponce Massacre that left hundreds wounded and at least 20 dead by Puerto Rican police under the orders of then Governor Blanton Winship. No one was ever held accountable. The U.S. repression against the independence movement worked. In 1952, 82% of voters approved a new constitution. The new constitution established Puerto Rico as a commonwealth, a convoluted designation which still raises legal questions. It also set up a U.S.-style three-branch system of government, which brings us to today. Although Puerto Rico has an independently elected government, it is still subject to federal laws. It's under this arrangement that Puerto Rico remains the largest U.S. colony and the world's oldest existing colony, governed by a colonial force and system its people did not choose, permanently stuck in an untenable limbo. This limbo has become increasingly unsustainable over the last 15 years. The federal government phased out tax breaks offered to businesses in Puerto Rico in 2006, which led to a decline in manufacturing jobs and eventually a recession, one that worsened as the global economy collapsed in 2008. It forced the Puerto Rican government to take on debts it couldn't pay off, a crisis exacerbated because the federal government prohibited Puerto Rico from declaring bankruptcy, which U.S. states can do. The island plummeted into the worst economic and fiscal crisis of its history. More than 12% unemployment has fueled a population decline, stripping the island of its human capital. Grasping for a solution, on June 30, 2016, then President Obama signed into law the Puerto Rico Oversight and Management Economic Stability Act, otherwise known as PROMESA. Chief among its tenets, the imposition of an unelected fiscal control board. The government was allowed to declare something akin to bankruptcy in 2017, but just a few months later, Hurricane Maria devastated the island. Maria alone inflicted an estimated $90 billion in damage, for which Congress allocated only $42.5 billion in disaster relief. The Trump administration allocated a mere $26 billion and didn't release most of it. The devastation laid bare the deteriorated infrastructure, the poverty hidden for decades, and the U.S.'s disregard for what was happening, and brought the question of Puerto Rico's status into a harsh spotlight, a question for which there are often four proposed answers: statehood, commonwealth, free association, and independence. Proponents of statehood argue that if Puerto Rico became a state, it could finally have congressional representation and reap the maximum possible federal benefits. This solution assumes that Puerto Rico could no longer be ignored by the federal government, ensuring the status of the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico is the same as those in the rest of the U.S. Commonwealth proponents emphasize that Puerto Rico becoming a state doesn't ensure equality, and the island would lose its distinct cultural heritage, tax benefits, and the choice to govern itself. Free association is an option designed to keep the island within the U.S. orbit as an unincorporated territory, and many Puerto Rican citizens who support it are concerned that becoming a state is just another neocolonial measure by a Western power. Proponents of independence say that the U.S. interrupted Puerto Rico's track to autonomy and independence, and say that the United States has exploited and abused Puerto Ricans. This brings us to the question of to be or not to be a U.S. state. Since the implementation of the Puerto Rican Constitution in 1952, Puerto Ricans have voted in 6 non-binding referendums on statehood, with 3 of those votes in the last 10 years. And yet, many of these votes have been steeped in controversy. In 2012, when statehood won for the first time, the ballot had 2 questions. The first asked if Puerto Rico should maintain the status quo as a territory. 54% said no. The second question gave a choice among several new options. 61% picked statehood, but over 500,000 voters left the second question blank as a form of protest. In the 2017 vote, statehood won again, but only 23% of the electorate turned out amid a boycott by those who opposed statehood. A referendum was held yet again in 2020. This time, the question was a simple yes or no. Should Puerto Rico be admitted immediately into the Union as a state? This question closely mimicked the wording of the Hawaii and Alaska statehood referendums. Statehood won a third time, this time with a slim majority, 52% of the vote. And yet, a simple yes or no referendum hardly seems to capture the complexities of the status question. Puerto Rico must be viewed within the framework of its colonial history, and its future should not be circumscribed to a yes or a no survey. Younger Puerto Ricans have lived through multiple bungled federal responses to disasters, government corruption, a never-ending recession, and President Trump's utter contempt for the island.
I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack.
After all that, young Puerto Ricans aren't interested in becoming the 51st state. The results of the island's last election illustrate this clearly. The social and political architecture of Puerto Rico is changing. For the first time, the traditional two-party system was broken, and a constellation of new parties that attracted large numbers of younger votes signaled a new direction for the territory entirely, away from statehood and moving more towards self-determination. The change is generational. To avoid making statehood the only option, effectively locking Puerto Rico into the same colonial framework offered to other states like Hawaii, Puerto Rican Representatives Nidia M. Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, alongside U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, have introduced the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. If passed, the act will allow a transparent and inclusive status convention for Puerto Rico citizens to elect delegates who will then formulate a fair ballot with non-territorial status options, which will then be voted on by the people of Puerto Rico, broadening the scope of potential futures for the island. Most Republicans in Congress are intent on avoiding the issue of the status of Puerto Rico, concerned about the admission of a state with largely Latinx voters and what that might mean for their electoral prospects, while some Democrats see Puerto Rico as a political chip and don't waver on policies that are hurting the island. In a truly democratic world, the decision over Puerto Rico's destiny should boil down to what Puerto Ricans chart for themselves, especially after 123 years of Washington imposing decisions on them. And judging by recent elections, a new generation is willing to walk away from the options of the past and embark on a new future.